And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., Charles Kupchan, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. In Boston, Massachusetts, Daniel Dresner, Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And joining us here in studio, Sergei Plekhanov, Political Science Professor at York University, and Janice Stein, TVO's Foreign Affairs Analyst and Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. Sergei, haven't seen you in a long time. It's good to have you back here. Janice, just saw you last week. Welcome back. And to our two friends in the States, it's good to have you along as well. I want to start, just in honor of Charles, because we know he's from Wisconsin, by quoting an historian from the University of Wisconsin. Here's Alfred McCoy, just for you, Charles, and then you get first kick at this. Alfred McCoy, who says, available economic, educational, and military data indicate that when it comes to U.S. global power, negative trends will aggregate rapidly by the year 2020 and are likely to reach a critical mass no later than 2030. The American century, proclaimed so triumphantly at the start of World War II, will be tattered and fading by 2025, its 8th decade, and could be history by 2030. Okay, Charles, what's your view of this rather dramatic forecast?
I would say that he put it a little bit too strongly. I'm not so much worried about the negative trends in the United States as the positive trends elsewhere. That is to say, if you just look at growth rates, at demographics, at education trends, clearly China, India, Brazil, Turkey are going to be rising, whereas the United States and the rest of the West will be either holding steady or rising much more slowly. So I think the key question is not, will power shift to new quarters? The answer to that is definitely yes. The question is, will the United States recover its economic and political dynamism so that it can help guide that transition? We don't know the answer to that right now. I would say that as of today, the U.S. economic system as well as the political system is pretty dysfunctional and needs to recover its equilibrium.
Daniel, as I get you to weigh in on that, let me first throw some numbers at you to help nudge you along. 61% of people surveyed by NBC and the Wall Street Journal in September say the United States is headed in the wrong direction, 61%. 65% believe the nation is in a state of decline. 66% say they're not confident that life for their children's generation will be better than their own. Are your fellow Americans sensing, apparently they are according to these surveys, that your country is in decline?
No, I think they're sensing that an economy has not been in terribly good shape for the last 2 years. And generally, when the economy is not doing terribly well, people turn sour in public opinion polls. My hunch is that if you had given these same polls, let's say 20 years ago, you would have actually probably gotten the same responses, except the concern would not have been about China rising to become the economic hegemon in the world, surrounded by Smurfs, but rather Japan. And that didn't happen either. So this is not to say that China's rise is not going to continue. I expect that it will. But I think we also have to be careful about extrapolating from what's happened over the last 10 years and assuming that there's going to be straight line projections into the future. I think that's a dangerous statement to make, and I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case.
Okay, Janice, you get to comment on this. Here's from Neil Ferguson. I got stuff for everybody today. Here's Neil Ferguson. Most imperial falls are associated with fiscal crises. Alarm bells should therefore be ringing very loudly. As the United States contemplates a deficit for 2009 of more than $1.4 trillion, about 11.2% of GDP, the biggest deficit in 60 years, and another for 2010 that will not be much smaller, public debt, meanwhile, is set to more than double in the coming decade, from $5.8 trillion in 2008 to $14.3 trillion in 2019. Within the same time frame, interest payments on that debt are forecast to leap from 8% of federal revenues to 17%. These numbers, Ferguson says, are bad. But in the realm of political entities, the role of perception is just as crucial, if not more so. In imperial crises, it is not the material underpinnings of power that really matter, but expectations about future power. Do you think managing the expectations is actually more important in this case for the United States?
I think managing expectations is very important, and these numbers are not good, but they're not bad. If there's one crucial number amidst the panoply of Neil's numbers, debt service payments will rise from 8% to 17%. That is not a bad number, 17%.
Relative to what?
Well, if you look at other economies, European economies, debt payments are higher in some of those. Japan's debt payments are higher. 17%. We in Canada, by the way, in the 90s, had debt service payments that were higher than 17%. And this is the worst case scenario. So I think we take a deep breath here. This was a fiscal crisis. There are ways, there are strategies for getting out of even quite difficult fiscal crisis. One is called inflating your way out. That is not beyond the realm of possibility here. And I agree with Dan. We are getting a reaction to a fiscal crisis that is hurting badly in terms of employment numbers in the United States. And there is a mood of what I call doom and gloom. The declinist industry is on a roll in Washington
you
right now.
think there's an industry right now that's making hay with this time?
Absolutely.
All right, Sergey, let me get your sense of how the United States is perceived in one place that you know very well, and that is Moscow. What do you think?
Well, they have mixed feelings about it. As you know, in Russia there was great concern in the past couple of decades that the United States has acquired this enormous power over the world. They exaggerate. In fact, if there's a place, a political place where they tremendously exaggerate the power of the United States, it's Moscow. So in some respects, it's a result of the precipitous decline of Russia in the past 20 years. Well, some resurgence in the past decade, but I mean, in the 1990s, it was a basket case. And when you decline so rapidly, you have a tendency to, to ascribe the reasons to some kind of a conspiracy. And of course, the prime suspect for the conspiracy of the United States, which indeed did control much of, a lot of aspects of Russian reform policies in the 1990s. But on the other hand, and that's a very significant shift in the past 2 years since Obama was elected, and a new dialogue in U.S.-Russian relations, the reset so-called, began. There's a desire to see the continuation of this partnership with the United States, which could cover a broad range of topics. And it's not just Russia-US, it's also Russia-NATO, Russia-European Union. So this trend is certainly welcome. And if the when they look at Obama and see the difficulties that he is facing in governance, and when they think in terms of, oh, the United States government is dysfunctional, they can't get the job done. For instance, if the US Senate fails to ratify the New START treaty, that will be seen, in some sense, a huge blow to the idea that the U.S. government can get its job done, but also a blow to this notion of partnership between Russia and the United States. So the Russians are of two minds about that.
Let me get Charles on that. Charles, there's one senator who, in essence, right now is holding up this strategic arms reduction treaty. If this treaty does not get passed, which apparently a panoply of former cabinet secretaries have come forward and said, we got to have this treaty. The administration wants the treaty. Much of the Senate wants the treaty.
NATO came up and said, officially, please ratify.
Got to have the treaty. But one guy's holding it up. What will that say about America's, ability to be a world player nowadays if it can't do that?
Well, it goes to the heart of the discussion that we've been having about whether the United States today has the political capacity to provide leadership. Is the country so polarized, with the Democratic Party pretty far over to the left, the Republican Party pretty far over to the right, that there isn't enough centrism, enough pragmatism to make good decisions? I think the jury is out on that. But I do want to say that I think what Janice said, what Dan said about the U.S. economy is true. We're not down and out by any means. But even if that's the case, you got to look at the global trends, that over the course of the next couple of decades, we will see power shift away from the Western world. We will see the United States probably be roughly equal to China by the end of the next decade, right around 2027, according to Goldman Sachs.
Equal in what way?
The 10 largest economies in the world will not be mostly Western. They will be mostly non-Western. So the world really is changing. And I think we who live in the U.S., in Canada, and Europe have to have a debate about how to prepare for a world in which the West is no longer the dominant player.
Daniel Dresner, do you want to make a distinction between America in decline and the West in decline?
Actually, what I would be concerned about is the distinction between the West versus the rest. It assumes that the rest is a unified, cohesive whole, and I don't think that's the case. I would push back on Charlie a little bit on 2 points. First of all, in terms of the demographics going down the road, I think Europe certainly has some issues, but in some ways China's going to have just as many issues, particularly after 2030 because of their one-child policy. They're going to have much larger percentage of their labor force approaching retirement than, let's say, the United States, for example. So I think structurally the trends are a little ambiguous. The second difference, and I think this is really crucial, is that even if you talk about the rise of other countries, and I agree with Charlie, I mean, obviously you're going to have countries like China and India becoming more powerful. The question is not whether they become more powerful, but how do they deal with each other, and then how do they deal with the United States? You can argue that one of the blessings that the United States has was its relative geographic isolation. So when it became a hegemonic power, it really didn't necessarily offend all that many countries until after World War II. On the other hand, a country like China, which is just now starting to try to exercise its power, has already experienced a severe amount of blowback, you can argue, from the rest of the Pacific Rim, as well as India, and eventually, I suspect, Russia.
Sergey.
I think there's a good point here that Daniel made about seeing the West as a unified whole. I wonder where we see a unified whole. We see the rapidly growing network around the world, and this is one of the results of globalization, dispersion of power, the rise of new centers of power. But this rise is occurring in the midst of rapidly growing interconnections between all these centers. They are more integrated than ever.
And therefore what?
And therefore, and by the way, is the United States a unified whole? We're looking at this dysfunctionality in the US government and the US economy. And one of the reasons is that the United States is not really a single piece, a single coherent piece, because it's too deeply involved in the affairs of the world. It's, in fact, the world controls the United States in a number of respects more than the United States controls the world. So we have to embrace this new situation, this new network, and learn to govern, to manage these networks in such ways as to avoid catastrophes.
Janice.
You know, it's really interesting because I think that's really, we're all having the same conversation about how we think out forward 25 years. Will the Chinese economy be larger than the United States? Almost all these discussions, Steve, project forward based on linear trends. And if we know one thing,
the world doesn't work in a linear fashion.
Right. We're going to be wrong.
Yeah.
All right. And so a lot of this literature actually looks at these trend lines and ignores the kinds of structural problems, for example, that China may face as it tries to move to the next level, as it tries to go up the value chain in its economy. Dan mentioned an absolutely crucial one. The demographics in China are much worse than those in the United States. The United States is the only developed country which is replacing itself. Nobody else. Now, the impact on productivity and the United States has huge problems with Social Security system and its old age system going forward, but it has a labor force that's sustaining itself. China does not, because of its one-child policy. And it's up against a wall, and it's up against a wall, frankly, in the near-term future rather than the long-term future. So I would be extremely careful with all these projections. There's no question that Asia is now dynamic, growing, innovative, that very important and exciting things are happening. That's different, though, from making the argument that the United States is going to decline.
We've heard a number of different ways of describing the United States. The French called it a hyperpower. Madeleine Albright called it the indispensable power in the world, the indispensable country.
Charlie Kramer called it the unipolar moment.
Unipolar moment. Well, we had Joseph Jaffe on the program not too long ago, and he said that the United States is still in this world the default power. And let's play a clip of what he had to say, and then we'll come back and talk. Go ahead, Michael, roll tape.
There's nothing happening unless the United States is there to do the heavy lifting. When we had war in Europe on our own doorsteps, it was the US Air Force who did it. When Al-Qaeda terrorism had to be defanged, it was the United States not only that did the fighting, but they assembled the posse in the Afghanistan war, in the first Iraq war. If you look at trying to solve the insoluble, which is the Middle East conflict, it is again the United States that is at the center of things. So call it indispensable, I would call it the default power. The default power is one that picks up the burden when there's nobody else.
Charles, can I get your view on his comment that the U.S. is still the default power in the world? Nothing gets done without the Americans doing the heavy lifting?
I would say that Joe is right, that the United States is still the most powerful actor, both diplomatically and in material terms, still enjoys a level of ideological appeal second to none. But I think the world that Joe describes is the one that we're leaving behind. If you look at the Middle East, if you look at East Asia, a lot goes on today without the United States. China is building a multilateral framework that challenges the hub-spoke structure the U.S. put together. When Obama went to Seoul a few weeks ago with a clear plan for the G20, his colleagues basically sent him packing. Turkey is now engaged in the Middle East in a way that runs up against and to some extent butts heads with the United States. Brazil and Argentina just said, let's recognize Palestine on the 67 borders. There's a lot happening in the world today without U.S. participation and indeed against U.S. wishes, and I'm afraid that that trend is only going to intensify in the years ahead.
Daniel, what's your view on that?
Here I tend to agree with Charlie a little bit. I mean, I think he's right. You know, the other examples would be Brazil and Turkey trying to negotiate a compromise with respect to Iran. You know, certainly China's tried to engage in outreach with Africa. They have an annual summit now. So I do think you're starting to see other great powers out there sort of taking initial baby steps, trying to expand their domestic orbit beyond just their region. Where I might disagree with Charlie a little bit is whether or not this is necessarily a bad thing for the United States. Part of what the U.S. is going to have to do in terms of dealing with what its current difficulties is going to be a policy of retrenchment. Now, retrenchment doesn't necessarily mean permanent isolation or anything like that. It means reassessing what really is important in terms of U.S. priorities and what's not. And so if you have other countries in the world starting to take a greater interest in their regions, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm not sure the U.S. should, in fact, be the sole superpower, let's say, trying to run things in Central Asia, Africa, you know, the Middle East and so forth. It might actually be a good thing, perhaps, for the U.S. to retrench a little bit and allow for other countries to actually assume the responsibilities, not to mention the headaches of trying to manage these trouble spots.
Sergey, what about that? Retrenchment for the U.S.? Yes?
Well, certainly. It's not really retrenchment. It's just recognition of this long-term glacial shift of power that's occurring. The current global system that we have is in a lot of ways the result of the American project, right? Mm-hmm. So now the Americans are suffering from some of the, not suffering, but having to accept some of the consequences of that success. That there is a global capitalist system which is very integrated, interlocked in a lot of ways, and there are multiple centers of power there, and it's beyond the power of the United States to control this system. So if you can't control it, you adapt to it. And it's not the first time that the Americans are adapting to change in the global balance of power. They've done so in the 1970s with mixed success, and then the Soviet Union imploded, happily for the United States, creating the illusion that the United States is now, you know, the big guy that can turn things around. And then in the Bush years, we've seen how misguided that was. So the adaptation and accepting the fact that you have to work with a lot of others, that's been the central point in Obama's review or revision of U.S. foreign policy. Let's work with others. Let's build partnerships. Because that's the only thing that works in the kind of world that we live in.
Well, let me try this as an example with you, Janice. Yugoslavia. The United States at first was content to let Europe try to resolve all of that when Yugoslavia exploded after the death of Tito, and Europe didn't do a very good job of it. And the U.S. had to come in and kind of get NATO on board and clean up the mess. So, you know, retrenchment, it's all well and good to say, but does the world still need the United States to take a lead in almost everything?
You know, it's really interesting because throughout this whole period of U.S. hyper-superpower, there were always things happening the United States did not want and did not control. So that's not, in fact, the right test. And we haven't had a test yet where there's a major crisis in a part of the world that explodes and we don't see the U.S. engagement. What we do see, and there's some interesting things happening. For instance, the Chinese and the Soviets have just agreed to set up.
The Soviets are gone.
Russians.
20 years.
The Russians and the Chinese, you're absolutely right, Sergey. Just agreed to set old habits die hard. Have just agreed to set up trading arrangements which make it possible for them to exchange commodities and trade commodities without going through the U.S. dollar. No. Without, and that's not an insignificant thing to happen. That would have been difficult to imagine. So you are seeing, in a sense, a diffusion of power. Charlie is right in that sense, that we're seeing power spread. We're seeing a capacity of important parts of the world to do business with each other, to cause trouble in their own regions without necessarily going through the United States. The big test, though, we have not yet seen. When a major crisis erupts, does the United States stand on the sidelines, or does it still exercise its default capacity?
Let me put that to Charles. Here maybe the best example. Well, here maybe is the best example today. North Korea. Can there be a resolution to the potential crisis that is North Korea without American involvement?
No, when it comes to security issues, and I would separate that from the economy right now, the U.S. is still the key player. The North Koreans want to talk to the U.S. The Iranians want to talk to the U.S. Why? Because it's the United States that, if something happens, is going to be the country that brings the military force to bear. So I agree with Janice that at least for now, there really is no other player that comes close to the United States in managing the security realm. But I want to come back for a second to something that Dan said, because it's very important. And that is, I think that the United States today has a foreign policy that is politically insolvent. That is to say, there is a range of commitments in Afghanistan and Iraq and beyond for which political support is really diminishing. And that's why I think what Dan said is important, that the U.S. needs to retrench, it needs partnerships, needs help to rebuild political support for a robust brand of engagement, because otherwise I fear the bottom may fall out, and that's when you get a neo-isolationist backlash. So in some ways I agree with Dan. It's a good thing that the U.S. can now look out at the world and say, hey, we've been running the show for a lot of decades, we're tired, we're losing our economic vitality, in part because we're spending so much abroad. Let's get help from others.
So Dan, are we officially in a situation now where George W. Bush's position that you don't want to be with us? Fine, we'll go it alone, we'll do it by ourselves. Those days are gone, is that right?
Well, oddly enough, I think it depends on who you ask. I mean, I think the Obama administration, as Sergei mentioned before, clearly believes that it has to work through partnerships, and clearly the reset relation with Russia is one example of that. If you take a look at public opinion polls, one of the interesting things is that in the Pew survey that was taken in December of 2009, you have two attitudes in the United States. The first is a belief that the U.S. wants to go it alone, in the sense that they actually seem to be adopting more of the Bush position on things. And the second is that the U.S. population really doesn't want to do all that much. So you're right, there is waning support for operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you could argue that, in fact, we actually are, we're certainly retrenching in Iraq in terms of the amount of troops deployed there. And whether it's 2011 or 2014, I suspect you're also going to see a beginning of retrenchment in Afghanistan as well. I would stress, though, it's dangerous to say, though, that those overseas commitments are actually what's taxing the American economy. If you take a look at the broad sort of structural problems in terms of the fiscal picture, the U.S. military is an important component, but it's hardly the most important component. That's right. Really, that's health care, and to a lesser extent, the fact that the U.S. is undertaxed. And that's what leads to sort of the scary budget projections that Janice talked about earlier. So in many ways, some of the biggest U.S. problems are not necessarily its overseas obligations, it's its domestic problems.
Okay, one thing we now know, Daniel Dresner is not a Republican. He just said the U.S. public is undertaxed. We have this now officially on the record. That's why he's teaching.
I actually am a Republican, so
You are a Republican, and you believe that the United States is undertaxed.
At this point, I'm a rhino. I'm a Republican in name only.
If you take a look at U.S. Massachusetts, right down.
In other words,
exactly.
Yeah.
If you take a look at taxes as a percentage of GDP, it's at historic lows in terms of the United States. So this is an instance where it's not that I want to see a huge government. I would just like to see tax revenue somewhat match government expenditures. And one of the more promising, I think, initiatives you might see in 2011 is the fact that President Obama has started talking about the idea of reforming the tax code as one way in which you might actually address the budget picture, with the idea that you would eliminate a lot of loopholes, but also lower the marginal rate. So you'd have lower taxes, but you'd actually have a tax system that would collect more revenues. And what's interesting is that even an arch conservative like Tom Coburn from Oklahoma has actually said he would be in favor of that kind of policy.
Sergei, you want to follow up?
We've been conflating two different things here when we were discussing possible alternatives to the course that the United States is following now in foreign affairs. You asked about returning to Bush Bush approach with us or your enemies, and identifying it with isolationism. It's not isolationism, it's aggressive imperialism, that's what it is. And unfortunately, if the United States faces this need to accept a more modest role in world affairs, that within the United States, in the American political class, in the American public, I think there are not only those who would like to turn away from the world, but also those who would like to lash out at the world, using whatever power the United States has, and it still has a lot. One of the reasons why some Republicans, it's not just one man, there's a section in the Republican Party which is dead set against the resumption of serious arms control, exemplified in the New START Treaty. One of the motivations is that the United States should not constrain its own military power. It needs dominance. It needs military dominance to deal with potential adversaries.
Yeah,
and that's a crucial
The only thing
point.
I would say, Sergei, is these tendencies that you're talking about are longstanding tendencies in the United States. Nothing has changed at all there. All these tendencies have been there. I think if we talk about retrenchment, we have to say what kind and where. The fact that there will be a pullback from presence on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan does not speak to retrenchment any more than the fact the United States withdrew its forces from Vietnam in the 70s, and that was a useful predictor.
So what do you say? It's just getting smart, is that all?
Well, that's right. You learn some things from policy that's not terribly well designed and very effective. Look what Secretary of State Clinton just said in Asia a month and a half ago when she was there at an ASEAN meeting, and there were issues around the South China Sea, and up she stepped to the plate and said, hey folks, I'm here and I will help you deal with China, much to China's fury. That is not the profile of a government or a leadership that feels itself poor, incapable of engaging, or at the early stages of a process of retrenchment. It's just not.
But it could also be mere posturing.
I don't think it is posture.
We'll
I don't
see.
think it is.
Could I just jump in here? Because I think that Janice is doing a little bit of what she said we shouldn't do, which is straight line projection. Because it's true that the U.S. has sort of stayed very steady in its global role, but look at beneath the surface. You're seeing roughly 50% of the American public say that it's time to focus on our own problems and stop trying to do so much abroad. You're seeing the beginnings in the Republican Party of a neo-isolationist wing called the Tea Party. They hail from the tradition in American politics that says that American ambition abroad comes at the expense of prosperity and liberty at home. So I agree with you, it's too soon to make any judgments, but I do think that we could be on the cusp of a turning inward, of a retrenchment. And you mentioned Vietnam. There was a retrenchment after Vietnam. Not only did we get out of Southeast Asia, but Nixon came and unfurled what he called the Nixon Doctrine,
But Charlie,
which
that
was
did
looking
not-
to others to do things that we were no longer willing to do
But
ourselves.
that so-called retrenchment did not predict decline, which is the issue here. People are looking at this at this kind of retrenchment and treating that as an indicator of decline.
And you say it's not.
Which I don't think it is.
Well, let me
That's
try
the point.
this.
No, I think Dan and I are talking about lightening the load. We're not talking about
Right.
a retreat. That's
Right.
that's very different.
Okay, Dan, Dan Dresden, let me try this with you. Obviously, there's a segment of the world that would like to, that believes that George W. Bush had it right, and that when America sees something out there that is in its interest to tackle, militarily especially, they do it, and they want a forceful response. And it's better if those out there fear America a little bit. That's not such a bad thing. This president seems to want to try to act more persuasively as opposed to forcefully. What's your view on the efficacy of that so far?
I think the problem is that policies like patient diplomacy don't necessarily yield short-term political benefits, is problem one. Problem two is I'm not entirely sure how large a percentage of the U.S. population really still embraces the sort of Bush position that you and the other participants have talked about. I mean, in 2008, during the 2008 election, the number one priority, the number one foreign policy priority for Americans was restoring American standing in the world. That's a rather extraordinary thing because it was the first time that issue actually went to the top of the charts, as it were. And that implies things like bolstering U.S. reputation. Now, the problem is that for some Americans, that means bolstering America's reputation in terms of things like respecting civil liberties, acting multilaterally, cooperating with others and so forth, whereas others were more furious not so much at the exercise of unilateral power, but rather the incompetent exercise of unilateral power. And so in that sense, it might, connect to a preference for the U.S. to act unilaterally, but to do so in a way that's actually efficient rather than what we saw in the case of Iraq. The problem is that there have been gaps between what the U.S. foreign policy establishment has wanted to do and the public, American public opinion for 30 years or so. Right. So I'm not sure that these sort of tides in terms of the American public opinion will actually influence what foreign policy is going to look like, because foreign policy is still by and large controlled by the executive branch.
Okay, but Charles, follow up on this if you would. There was a time, I think it's fair to say, there was a time in this world where if you said no to the United States, You know, I don't want to say you're taking your life into your hands, but maybe sometimes you were taking your life into your hands. Do other countries, do other heads of state around the world today fear saying no to the United States in a way that they once did?
I think that their concern that they will somehow end up in the deep freeze is much less than it used to be, and that countries, including major countries, are willing to cross the United States more than they used to. And that's simply a product of what we've been talking about, that the world is getting more diffuse, power is diffusing, that there are other countries out there, what we call emerging powers, that feel that they have a greater voice, and they have a lot of wind in the sails. I mean, let's keep in mind, despite some of the problems that Janice mentioned in China, that 80% of the Chinese public thinks their country is heading in the right direction. That gives the Chinese government a real spring in their step in a way that we simply don't see in Europe or the United States today because of lagging economies and polarized political systems. So I do think that we're in a world where we're just going to see more and more countries taking a course separate from what the United States might like it to do.
You know, I agree with Charlie that there are countries that are very comfortable saying no to the United States. That's also not new. If you work on the Middle East, governments have always felt comfortable saying no to the United States. That's a 30 or 40.
How about this country? Is this country on that list?
Well, we said no in 2003, long before there was...
Different government.
We had a different government. We said no. We said no, and we're the closest neighbor of the United States. We said no, and there was a lot of predictions.
On Iraq, you're saying?
That's right.
On Iraq.
That's right.
In the Cold War, lots of countries were saying no to the United States.
Said no.
It's not
So
a new
again,
situation.
I don't think that, you know, the real point I'm trying to make here is that most of the indicators we use, if we push them back 30 or 40 years, they don't work very well to predict decline. That's the problem. And that's what makes me, public opinion polls, which you just quoted, see, in China, you know, I wouldn't put huge weight on that. What is interesting in both China and India, and it's very interesting the language that you hear when you talk to the equivalent of the four of us in those countries, the chattering classes, right? So the language you hear in both countries is not about the decline of the United States at all. It is about we are returning to our historic position. So in 1700, for example, China and India controlled about depending on how you measure, 50 to 60% of the world economy. So they're reacting to their own period of decline, which they felt you know, humiliated by. And there is optimism, there is a sense of resurgence there. Charlie's right. And it's palpable, that sense of optimism. But it's not U.S. directed.
Let me jump in here because we've got
Steve,
4 minutes to go. Okay, Dan, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, to piggyback on what Janice said, one of the interesting things, again, if you look at the public opinion surveys, is that surveys among the advanced countries, the United States and Western Europe, you ask them who they think the most powerful country is, and the answer has been China. The majority answer is usually China, the plurality answer is China. But the funny thing is, if you survey the developing world and ask them the same question, the answer now still remains the United States. Yeah. So part of the problem is that there's a misperception among different publics about who is the most powerful country. It always seems like the other country is more powerful rather than the country in your region. And I think that's one of the issues, you know, going forward. And also to add on what Charlie said, I think there's been a diffusion of power, and I think what that means is that more countries can deter U.S. pressure. So as a result, more countries, I think, can say no than used to be the case. What hasn't occurred, however, is that no other country has the ability to compel others to change their policies. Compellence power still only resides in the United States, even if it's waning in the United States. So as a result, you basically have an international system where a lot more countries have a veto. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the U.S. is less powerful, but it's not clear that any other country has the capabilities that the U.S. had 10 years ago.
Sergey.
I was just going to say that I'm not surprised that Europeans do not see the United States as the most powerful country because they're less under the control of the United States than the third world. In the third world, you feel the brunt of American power more than you do in Europe. That's it.
But you know, you also hear some very, very negative comments about China because of its very, very visible presence in parts of Africa, for instance. So you have some of these same dynamics, and that's why this is, you know, this is a
nobody likes very powerful nations.
Complicated system that works at multiple levels, and the effort to pin it down and fit it neatly into a box is really tough to do.
We're going to put this last question into a box because we got 2.5 minutes to go. And Charlie, let me start with you on this one. The election of Barack Obama was supposed to make America a more likable country around the world. 2 years later, is that the case?
Yes, it is the case. I mean, if you look at public opinion polls from Pew or the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, German Marshall Fund, you see quite striking increases, with a few exceptions, Israel, Turkey among them, but mainly views of the United States, popularity of the United States abroad have gone up markedly, and that's largely because Obama is a likable figure, because he's gone back to more of a multilateral policy than a unilateral policy. But it does beg the question, how much has that gotten us? Is Obama able to pursue rapprochement with Cuba, with Syria, with Burma, with Iran, with North Korea, because there is a greater likability of the United States? The answer to that is generally no. I think it's good for the U.S. to be liked abroad, but it doesn't mean that the U.S. is going to get its way. That's more of a question of power and interests. Dan
Dresner, better to be liked more or feared more?
It's better to be respected more, which is a combination of the two. But that said, I agree with Charlie that even though U.S. standing has probably risen in terms of public perceptions, it's been harder for Barack Obama to get what he wanted. In part because I think, first of all, the increase in U.S. respect and in terms of public opinion polls is mostly because it was such an incredibly low base around 2006. So partly it was just inevitably going to return. And second, you had countries that previously used to use, anti-Americanism as a dodge, particularly in Europe, to do things like send troops to Afghanistan, which they didn't want to do. Now they simply don't want to do it for actual innate policy reasons. So yeah, I think Barack Obama is experiencing some difficulty trying to get what he wants. That said, every country is experiencing difficulty in terms of getting what they want. This is not unique to the United States.
Janice, for once, we're going to let the guy from Tufts have the last word, okay?
Absolutely.
Because we're out of time. Charles Kupchan from Georgetown University and the Council on Foreign Relations, thank you for being there on the line for us from Washington, D.C. Daniel Dresner from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, appreciate your participation as well. From Boston, home of the next year World Series champion Red Sox, Sergei Plekhanov from York University, Janice Stein from the Munk School, thanks so much to you two as well.
You're so welcome.
Thank you.